What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? So, Dr. Ratio's been out in the game for a little while now, and I've been running a lot of tests on the guy. A whole heckin' of a lot, in fact. And so have a lot of the other people that I've been talking to. So I wanted to report those findings to you to determine what the best relic sets for Dr. Ratio are, and how well he's actually performing in the game. So, let's go ahead and take a look at this, because you might be surprised by some of the findings that we actually found. So I firstly wanted to point out that I did this testing with Dr. Ratio on Memory of Chaos 12 Side 1, because all of the enemies that mattered were imaginary weak, and that's what most players are going to be using their Dr. Ratio with. Imaginary weak enemies, that's what you do. And I did this testing for every single relic combination that I used, with at least 5 good runs for each combination. That way I got a good average of how they were performing, because they didn't always clear at the exact same cycle every time, and I wanted to get good accurate information. And if a run wasn't going very well, I reset in order to keep the findings fair and accurate. I also wanted to point out that I tried 2 different team compositions per relic combination, because I figured it would be a good idea, because not every single player has the same team that I used, so I tried 2 different teams to try to give some variety to the results. It also means that I had to spend a lot more time testing this out than I originally planned, but I figured it would be a good idea. One last thing I wanted to point out about the criteria that I used is that I did not necessarily use my best relic sets on Dr. Ratio that I had available, because it wouldn't be fair to some of the other relic sets if I used, for example, my best in slot imaginary gear. So I wanted to keep all the stats on Dr. Ratio relatively the same, so I used gear that kind of kept all the stats roughly the same. You might see me on screen right now fading through different relic combinations that I used with the stats on screen, so that I can prove that I kept everything relatively the same. Obviously, it's not literally point to point the exact same, but it's the best that I could do under the circumstances. I even tried a combination using the 2-piece Hackerspace and the 2-piece follow-up set with a speed boot, just to throw it in there for some extra gags. The sets that I ended up rolling around with were the 4-piece Quantum set, the 4-piece Imaginary set, the 4-piece follow-up set, and then combinations of the 2-piece Muskateer set with the 2-piece follow-up set, the 2-piece Hackerspace set with the 2-piece follow-up set, and the 2-piece Imaginary set, as well as the 2-piece follow-up set. Now, just so that you guys are all aware, this was testing to find out the best 4-piece sets. I stuck with the same Planar Sets because I do feel like Inert Silsato is the better set. It's easier to build around. However, if you have a good Glemoth set, you can use this as well. It is all stat roll dependent after all. Just because some of these sets might be better on average than the others doesn't mean you shouldn't use your good stats. Stats, stats, stats. Use the good stuff that you have. This also made it more consistent for the testing, because if I stuck with the same Planar set, it didn't jumble everything around. It made it easier to try to stick to roughly the same amount of crit values and things like that. Let's first go over the 4-piece Quantum set, because I was really happy with these results. I didn't end up talking about the 4-piece Quantum set in my original Dr. Ratio build guide, despite having talked about it with people in my Discord, because the 4-piece Quantum set is ideally used under certain circumstances, and you're not always going to be in those circumstances. But I'm happy to report that this set actually did really well, despite it only working best against quantum weak enemies. It still works well if the enemies are weak to imaginary, despite not getting the full 4-piece bonus from the set. It was also a pre-release guide, and I couldn't tell you guys definitively with 100% confidence that it would end up being a really good set, and I didn't want to steer players the wrong way. Imagine it ended up not being a good set and I told you guys to use it. That would have been much worse. So the teams that I ended up using don't differ necessarily too much. I used Dr. Ratio, Silverwolf, Ruan Mei, and Fu Xuan. And the other team I used was Dr. Ratio, Pela, Ruan Mei, and Fu Xuan. Not that much of a difference, but it's what I had available to use. Now let's go over the results, with the understanding that I wasn't using the most ideal Dr. Ratio setup I had necessarily, because I wanted to keep the findings fair, which is actually a good thing in the end, because most players can probably achieve what I was able to do with these relic sets. Now let's move forward. I'm very happy to say that the Quantum set works very well on Dr. Ratio. Despite not using the best setups I could have for Dr. Ratio, we were still clearing in 4 cycles on average with the Pela team, and 4 to 5 cycles with the Silverwolf team. Again, I wasn't using my best setup for him, but most players can achieve this. That was the point of these findings. So be aware of that, and you might be wondering why the Silverwolf team didn't perform quite as well as the Pela team, despite Silverwolf potentially being able to apply Quantum Weakness, giving us the 4-piece bonus some of the time. But that's because, full disclosure, the Pela is actually favored in this particular Memory of Chaos that we're in right now, because she has an AoE that can break the toughness of enemies, giving us a bonus through this particular domain. So just be aware that in many other situations, the Silverwolf would actually outperform the Pela. Just something I wanted to point out. The most important thing in this video is actually the relics themselves, not necessarily the team composition. However, this is a little bit of a weird case because Silverwolf can apply the Quantum Weakness. Again, like I said, Silverwolf would normally be the better team setup for this relic set, but in this particular domain, in case you guys were curious, the Pela was actually outperforming just a little bit more than the Silverwolf team. Don't forget that your setup can actually work better than what I was using here. I sort of held myself back with the stat restriction that I held myself to, so just keep that in mind. Now, let's move on to the 2-piece Imaginary and the 2-piece follow-up set. This set performed very, very well. In fact, it had the same average as the Quantum set. Now, be aware this was a pretty ideal scenario for this setup because the enemies were imaginary weak, and you do get that imaginary bonus from the 2-piece Imaginary set. So just keep that in mind. So the Pela team was clearing at roughly 4 cycles, and the Silverwolf team, like the Quantum setup, was actually clearing in 4 to 5 cycles as well. So this next set I wanted to talk about is a pretty obvious one. It's the 4-piece Imaginary set. Now, a little disclaimer with this set, and the point I want to make is that if you can imprison the enemies, this set is very, very good. But if you can't imprison the enemies, this set does not do quite as well as some of the others we have been testing. So just be aware of that. So if the enemy is imaginary weak, this set will do very well because that's how you can imprison the enemies with your Doctor ratio, by breaking their weakness. So this set performed at roughly 4 cycles on average and roughly 4 to 5 cycles on average with Silverwolf. However, it was really, really tight. I felt like it was, if I had just reset a few more times, it would have been an average of 4 with Silverwolf and 4 with Pela. Now, if I had reset several more times, I think I could have probably gotten a 3 cycle with this set. So keep that in mind. This set may have performed the best out of any of the other sets here. But also keep in mind, if the enemies were quantum weak, I probably could have done the same thing with the Quantum set and the Imaginary set. So spoilers, the Quantum set and the Imaginary set, in my opinion, were working the best, but only under the right circumstances. If you don't have those right circumstances, these sets might suffer unless you have a good situation. Like the Quantum set still performs well with Defense Shred allies on your team. However, if the enemies aren't imaginary weak, the imaginary 4-piece bonus is not there and the set kind of falls off. So just keep that in mind. The results from the 2-piece Muskateer set and the 2-piece follow-up set were also very promising. This pretty much performed as well as the 2-piece Imaginary and the 2-piece follow-up, which I'm sure many of you could have called from a mile away. So it did perform roughly 4 cycles with the Pela and the 4 cycles to 5 cycles with the Silverwolf. Now, this last relic set surprised me a little bit, and in kind of a good way. This is the 4-piece follow-up set, and there's a little bit of a problem with this relic set as far as it goes for Doctor ratio. It seems like it was made for other follow-up characters and not necessarily for him, because he doesn't get to properly build up the stacks on this effect with the 4-piece bonus before the effect actually falls off. Despite this, his damage is pretty good with the relic set on. He was able to clear roughly 4 to 5 cycles with Pela and roughly 4 to 5 cycles with Silverwolf. Just be aware, I did do several resets because some of the time it dipped into 6 cycles if things weren't going very well in combat. Now, some of you might say, oh, that's not very fair that you reset, but I reset with a lot of the other sets as well. So the average at the end of the day was still 4 to 5, even though it was much, much tighter. This relic set didn't perform as well as the others, full transparency. Out of all the other sets I tried, this one didn't perform as well. So keep that in mind, but I still wanted to try it out anyways. Now I want to point out that despite some of the averages between these relics being very similar, if you were in my position testing these out, you would have understood that a lot of these were actually a lot more comfortable and performed better than some of the others. Now, to be fair, many people will say it doesn't matter how easily you cleared that cycle, if you cleared it at the same time, it's still the same cycle clear. And although that is true, some of these relic sets still performed a little bit better than the others, and I figure it's worth showing you guys what I ranked these as in my calculations. Just be aware, the quantum set can perform the best under the right circumstances, but of course, under the right circumstances, the imaginary set can also perform as well. It mainly depends on the enemy weakness, so just be aware of that. So as you can see on screen, I have the rankings right now, but I think it is important to mention that the follow-up 4-piece set didn't work as well as the others, and the Hackerspace set with the right speed boot setup can perform as well as the others, but if you can just get enough speed on Dr. Ratio, it is best to not use the Hackerspace set, so keep that in mind. The Hackerspace set is just something you might want to try out in case it was available to you, but I would try to invest in getting good substats on other gear instead. So, full disclosure, the Hackerspace set and the follow-up set, that is not something I would go with. I'd mainly focus in on going with like the quantum set if you're able to do so under the right circumstances, the 4-piece imaginary set, again, under the right circumstances, but something to be aware of, the 2-piece imaginary with the 2-piece follow-up, and the 2-piece Muskateer with the 2-piece follow-up work well in just about any scenario that you could put yourself in, so keep that in mind. I might make a team composition guide for Dr. Ratio because there's some interesting team setups you wouldn't necessarily think would be good on him that perform really well, but be aware the 2 teams I use here today are very good in case I don't end up making the guide for whatever reason. If you found this video helpful or informative in any way, shape, or form, please consider leaving a like and subscribe, and maybe I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.